What exactly is inflation? Some of you probably already know the answer. Inflation is the generalized increase in prices. If with a 10% inflation level, that is with a 10% price increase, I want to maintain the same standard of living, then I'll have to charge 10% more. It is for this reason that year after year, pensioners, tenants, and workers demand to be compensated for it. In other words, pensions, rents, and salaries need to be increased so as not to reduce their standard of living. And obviously, in the case of those who are paid by the government, this increase is usually accompanied by a juicy tax increase for everyone else. Well, so far, pretty straightforward, don't you think? But what if I told you that all of this is wrong? And if I told you that our way of interpreting inflation is not realistic, that it is in fact incorrect? What if I told you that all this time we've been miscalculating inflation? Today on Visual Economic, we are going to explain to you exactly what the problem is with the calculation of inflation. Check this out. Well, let's start with the basics. How is inflation calculated? The answer is that the methods vary slightly from country to country, but generally the Consumer Price Index, the CPI, is used. Basically, this method consists of putting together a basket with the products that families consume the most, things like vegetable, gasoline, and electricity, to see how the prices change over time. Typically, CPI baskets have about 500 items. However, in order to better understand the story, let's follow a slightly simpler example. Imagine that we have to decide which means of transportation we are going to use this month. For this, we have two alternatives. I can buy gasoline for the car at $2 a litre, or I can opt for subway tickets at $2 each. Since I don't like having to search for parking or endure endless traffic jams at peak times, but I also like eating in the car, let's say we alternate between the two options. So let's say we buy 100 subway tickets and 150 litres of gasoline. This will be our personal CPI basket. Now, let me ask you a question. Is this the only basket that I can use? Well, obviously not. An alternative basket, for example, would be to buy 300 subway tickets and 60 litres of gasoline. In this way, you would sacrifice 90 litres of gasoline for 3 times as many subway tickets. And as far as traffic jams go, let's just say with this trade-off, we might be willing to give up the convenience of the car. But in other words, let's assume that both the first and second baskets generate the exact same level of satisfaction. Although, of course, if they are equivalent, which of these two baskets would we choose? Well, the answer comes down to the price. While the first basket costs only $500, the second one will cost $720. So there's no doubt we'll take the 100 subway tickets and the 150 litres of gasoline. Now, what would happen if the following year the price of gasoline were to rise, for example, to $8 a litre? In that case, buying basket 1 would no longer cost me $500, but it would cost me $1,400. In terms of inflation, this would imply an increase of 180%. That is an annual CPI of 180%. Well, knowing this, let me ask you a question. What would have to happen for me to be able to maintain my purchasing power? Well, supposedly, according to popular convention, what we would have to do is ask, by all means possible, for a salary increase, an increase of at least up to $1,400, which is the money that would be needed to continue buying the first basket. Right? Well, as it turns out, no. Because as we mentioned before, the theory that is always used is wrong. Do you remember the second basket, the one that initially cost $720? The alternative basket that gave us the same satisfaction that we disregarded due to a matter of cost? Well, now things have changed, haven't they? It turns out that this basket is now cheaper because although it has also risen in price, it has only risen to $1,080. Do you realize what this means? If I adjust my income in line with the CPI and earn an extra $1,400, I would no longer buy the first basket. I would buy the second, and I would have a lot of money for other things. In other words, by adjusting my money to the CPI, I would not be maintaining my purchasing power, I would be increasing it. This, Visual Economic viewers, is what is known as the substitution effect. If the price of a product goes up, I will try to substitute it with as much as possible with alternatives that generate a similar degree of satisfaction. The CPI is a measure of inflation that overestimates the increase in the cost of living. If there is a 10% inflation rate, it is not necessary to increase wages by 10% to maintain purchasing power. What is necessary is to increase wages enough to be able to purchase an equivalent basket of goods. And this leads directly to another question. If CPI inflation is higher than it should be, then how can we calculate real inflation? Would it be enough to correct the CPI downwards a little bit? Well, Visual Economic community, if only it were that simple, then we would not have had to make this video, because the substitution effect we have just seen is just the tip of the iceberg. Check this out.
The Boskin Report.
In 1996, the US Senate began to realize that something was wrong with the CPI. So perhaps for political reasons, or perhaps for genuine economic reasons, it was decided to create a commission with 5 expert economists to calculate how much the consumer price indicator deviated from, reality. Its objective was to come up with a measure that could reliably represent the real changes in the standard of living, avoiding the biases of the CPI. One of those biases is precisely the one we've already seen, the substitution bias. However, the Boskin Commission found other even more significant biases. The first was quality bias. Let me explain. Imagine that to turn on all the appliances we have, we need $300 every month. Therefore, if the price of electricity increases by 10%, we'll need $330 to maintain the same lifestyle. But what would happen if, at the same time that the price of energy goes up 10%, I buy newer and more modern appliances that consume half as much electricity? Which, after all, is what we do as the time goes by, if only because the technological evolution of the devices being sold. Well, in that case, you would no longer need $330, as the CPI would indicate, but only $165. But how important is this in real life? Well, take note, because it turns out that the Boskin Commission determined that not taking technological progress into account made the CPI in the United States 20.47% higher than it really should be. At the same time, in Europe, and confirming the Boskin report's predictions once again, a more recent study by the Bank of Spain determined that the effect amounts to 26% in that country. But there's more. Another type of bias that does not take into account the CPI is known as the free effect. Let me explain. Around 15 to 20 years ago, we all had to buy a video camera if we wanted to record our trips, grandpa's birthday, or any other special event. However, now that's something we all do for free with our cell phones. And the question is this reflected in the CPI? Well, no, it isn't. If people stop using video cameras or developing film, these things are simply taken out of the CPI calculation basket and something else is put in. You see, our standard of living has actually improved. We can do more with less, but the CPI is blind. Again, the CPI will show a higher cost of living increase than there actually is. So the question then is, what happens if we take all these effects into account? According to the Boskin Commission data, what is the total error of the CPI? Well, for this one, you'd better be sitting down, because according to the data of the Commission, the estimated error is almost 40%. Specifically, the CPI overestimates purchasing power costs by 37.54%. To be clearer, while in 1996 the US CPI showed inflation of 2.93%, the real cost of living increase was only 1.83%. And take note, because this difference accumulated over several years can be very significant. But be patient, because so far we've only seen part of the problem of bias in the calculation. But along with that, there is another equally troubling problem. Want to know all about it? Of course you do. So let's take a look now.
A matter of groups.
VisualEconomik viewers, as we have already said, the CPI is a calculation based on a basket that includes the products that are most consumed in a country on average. Do you realize what this means? Imagine that the CPI rises because of the price of digital or technological products increases, and those products have a relevant presence in the average basket. Does it make sense to update the pensioners of retirees who hardly use any technology using the CPI? Well, obviously, no. In the same way, since the reference basket is an average of the products consumed by households, then the households that have more money and spend more have a greater influence when estimating the average basket. This is what is called the Plutocratic Gap, a gap that, according to researchers such as Ruiz Castillo, Ley, and Izquierdo, in this case, for example, of Spain, also inflated the CPI between the 1980s and 2000. Along the same lines, another issue that is not usually taken into account by the CPI is geographical differences. For example, in the United States, the surveys used to calculate the basket are very focused on large cities. And although life in the countryside is very different, the CPI basket reflects above all the changes in urban life. However, I think it has already been made clear quite how deficient an indicator is as a measure of the cost of living. But is this really a problem? What are the real life consequences? How could it be solved? Let's find out.
The Big Snowball.
One of the main problems with the difference between the CPI and the real cost of living is that governments tend to spend much more than they should by adjusting wages, taxes, and pensions according to this index. For example, according to the Spanish report mentioned previously, a 0.6% error in the calculation of the CPI in the 1990s caused a public cost overrun of about 1.4% of gross domestic product. And keep in mind that we are not talking about 1.4%, but about 1.4% in only 10 years. Almost 3 decades have passed since the calculation was made, and if an error similar to the one calculated had been maintained, we could be talking about a public cost overrun of 4% of GDP. In other words, a cost overrun equivalent to all that the Spanish state spends on public education, which sooner or later may imply a tax increase. So don't be surprised when news stories like this one appear about Spain.
Spending on pensions increases by 7.8 billion due to the increase in the CPI. 37 out of every 100 euros of the budget will be used to pay for retirement, and the rest of the benefits paid by the Social Security.
However, in all fairness, it must be said that Spain is far from being the only case. A similar calculation for the United States, based on estimates similar to those of the Boston Commission, found that the US public deficit could be increasing by about 0.5% of GDP every 5 years. Yes, it's somewhat lower than in Spain, but public spending in the United States is lower. Even so, the figure is still considerable. And we're only talking about the implications of public spending, but evidently the problem goes beyond that. Updating wages and incomes by the CPI, for example, due to union pressure, can have a very negative effect on a country's competitiveness. And not only that, it can feed a huge inflationary spiral. Imagine that the cost of living rises by 1%, but that the CPI is 2%. In that case, people will demand wage and rent increases of at least 2%, which will in turn increase production costs, which will in turn cause the CPI to overstate the increase again, and it's back to square one. The inflationary spiral has been set in motion. A future crisis is now closer. But having said that, we still have an important question to answer. Is there a better way to measure the cost of living? Can we resolve the problems of the CPI? Well, of course, there's always a more hopeful path. In fact, some of these solutions are gradually being implemented, albeit at the usual pace of public administration. For example, to correct the substitution effect problem, we could replace the traditional CPI with a measure called the Fisher Price Index. We'll not go into too much detail here, but it is an estimator that is much less affected by changes in the consumption basket. Another solution would be to update the consumption basket annually to better reflect changes in the goods actually consumed, as well as to take into account technological advances. This annual update is called the Chained Cpi, and a study by the US Congressional Research Service estimated that using it instead of the traditional CPI would reduce the public deficit by $69.3 billion by 2023. Another option would be to make gauges adjusted to more specific groups, taking into account geographical, age, or social class differences, so that we could apply a customized CPI to each of these population groups. But having come to this point, it's time to hand the reins over to you. How would you more accurately measure the change in people's cost of living? Were you aware that the CPI was such a biased measure? Have you been able to change your consumption patterns easily when something has gone up a lot in price? You can leave your answers in the comments below. And as always, don't forget that here on Visual Economic, we release new videos every week. So subscribe to this channel and hit the little bell button down there so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like this video, like it so we know. All the best, and I'll see you next time.